Good evening, everybody. We are continuing with Unintended Consequences, a novel by John Ross. And we will be starting on page 455, which we'll call section 2P, so part 2P. And we left off at page 454 of part 2.0 as an Oscar. Again, this is a quick reminder. If you're just finding us randomly, that's great, but check the comments and get to Dan Hauser's playlist of the first half of this book and then come back here. So just a friendly reminder. And let's go ahead and start on page 455, part 2P. June 12th, 1990. Randy Weaver called the man in the U.S. Forest Service truck. "You're talking to him." The two men in the federal vehicle looked at one another, then got out of the truck and walked to the house. "You weren't home," the man who had been driving said. Weaver shrugged at the accusation. He had driven over to a friend's house not far from his own cabin in the Idaho wilderness. He hadn't been expecting anyone, least of all Forest Service employees, to come calling. "We're with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms," the second man volunteered. Weaver's eyes narrowed at this bit of information. "Yeah? Last summer, you sold a shotgun that was under the minimum length. The man you sold it to was one of ours. We have it on tape." Weaver said nothing. He had indeed sold a shotgun the year before, a Harrington and Richardson single barrel. Randy Weaver knew that the barrel had been over 18 inches federal minimum, but that didn't mean anything. The buyer could have easily cut the barrel off a little more after Randy left. The two federal agents looked at each other nervously. Finally, one of them spoke. "Look, you're in serious trouble, mister. 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. How's your family going to like that?" Weaver still said nothing. "We've come here to offer you a deal," the other man said. Weaver stared at him. "We want you to work for us. Get in the Aryan Nation camp. We know you've been there. And tell us what they got, what their layout's like. We'll give you all the stuff you'll need and tell you where to put it. Do that for us and we might..." "Forget it." "Listen, Weaver, you can't act like..." "I said forget it." "You're the only one who's forgetting something, tough guy," the other agent broke in. "You're forgetting who we are and what we can do. You had that shotgun in your house before you sold it, and we'll just say that's where you cut it down. Then you transported it in your truck to sell it. Under the seizure guidelines, both your house and your vehicle were used to facilitate the commission of that felony. That means they're ours, whether we prove you sold our man that gun or not. What you got to say to that, tough guy?" "Well, fuck off and die," Weaver said, then walked past the agents, climbed into his truck, and drove away. "I'm going to write them a letter," Vicki Weaver told her husband. "Tell them to watch out for anyone new." Randy Weaver shook his head in disgust. "I thought we headed off this kind of crap in '85, he said angrily. He turned and walked into the other room. Randy Weaver was not now and had never been a member of Aryan Nations. He had made that fact clear in a sworn affidavit 5 years before. That did not mean, however, that Randy was ready to become a spy for the BATF and plant contraband to help the feds facilitate a raid. Vicki agreed. She insisted on warning the white supremacy group of the attempt to coerce her husband into infiltrating their organization. The lever that the feds were vainly attempting to use on Randy Weaver to make them do their bidding was the National Firearms Act of 1934. The BATF claimed that Weaver had sold their informant a shotgun upon which Weaver had failed to pay a $5 tax to the Treasury as per the 1934 Act. The shotgun, a Harrington and Richardson single barrel worth about $50, had a barrel 18 1/2 inches long, which was eminently legal. However, the overall length of the weapon in question was 25 5/8 inches due to the fact that the buttstock had been shortened. This was 3/8 below the federally approved 26-inch minimum overall length for the Title I firearms, making it a Title II, any other weapon, and subject to NFA regulation. It would never be officially determined just who was responsible for shortening the piece of wood, this final 3/8 of an inch. Some would claim that Randy Weaver, like most proficient shooters, had been well aware of the 18-inch barrel rule, but was ignorant to the 26-inch overall length regulation, which was much less well known, even among the most ardent of shooting enthusiasts. Others, including Randy himself, would maintain that the gun was legal when Weaver sold it to the BATF informant, and that either the informant or someone else in the agency had whittled the wood down the final 3/8 inch after the gun was no longer in Weaver's possession. There were several things that were not in dispute, however, things that virtually everyone on both sides of the issue agreed on. Everyone agreed that belonging to a religious sect which believed its members were God's chosen people was not a crime. Everyone also agreed that moving to a sparsely populated rural area whose few inhabitants were of the same racial and ethnic background was not a crime. Not one person had ever accused Randy Weaver of assault, robbery, theft, verbal abuse, littering, or any crime which harmed any other person physically, monetarily, or emotionally. Every person involved with the case agreed that, at most, Randy Weaver had committed one crime and one crime only. All subsequent actions of federal agents involving Randy Weaver and his family were based on the presumption that Weaver was guilty of failing to pay the Treasury a $5 tax on a $50 shotgun, and that tax was due the government because a piece of wood was 3/8 of an inch too short. January 17th, 1991. "That's a hell of a place to break down," Vicki Weaver said when she saw the truck stalled in the middle of the bridge, blocking both lanes. She and Randy were heading into Naples, Idaho, 5 miles from their home. The stalled truck's hood was open, and a man and a woman were peering into the engine compartment. "Let's go give them a hand. If I can't get it running, 4 of us ought to be able to push it over into one lane at least," Randy said as he slowed his vehicle and pulled over to the side of the road. He and Vicki got out and walked up to the other motorists. "What's the problem?" Randy asked as he walked up to the stalled vehicle. "Can we give you a Federal agents, you're under arrest," the man yelled, cutting Weaver off in mid-sentence as he whirled around and held a gun to Randy's head. The woman, on cue, grabbed Vicki Weaver at the same time. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will..." The agent droned on, reciting the Weavers' Miranda rights as he and the woman agent handcuffed Randy and Vicki's wrists behind their backs. Randy and his wife were herded into the back of the camper by the woman as the male agent lowered the hood and got in the driver's seat of the truck. Randy Weaver smiled grimly at his wife and settled in for the drive to the federal magistrate in Coeur d'Alene. Because neither he nor Vicki had criminal records, Vicki would be released immediately and Randy would spend one night in jail. The judge allowed Randy to go home after signing a $10,000 property bond. Throughout the proceeding, Randy Weaver silently vowed that the feds would never fool him again. February 19th, 1991. "Looks like Weaver's not going to show up, Your Honor." The federal judge slammed his gavel on the bench in reply. "Issue a warrant for his arrest. Order the federal marshals to bring him in. Next case." Neither of the men realized that the date on the summons they had sent Randy Weaver had been the wrong one. The stakes had just been raised for the entire Weaver family. December 16th, 1991. John Lawmaster wondered what his wife was up to as he hung up the telephone. He shook his head as he reached into the pocket for his car keys and headed for the garage. In the tradition of divorced men everywhere, he reminded himself that he was lucky not to have a real crazy psycho-hate relationship with his ex. That was something to be grateful for. Lawmaster got in his car and pulled out of the garage. Ted Royster smiled as he watched John Lawmaster drive away. Lawmaster's ex-wife had done her job perfectly. He picked up the microphone to his mobile radio. "Okay, we're all set," he announced. "Let's do it." Royster was the head of the regional office of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms located in Dallas. The Dallas office controlled all ATF operations in Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Royster liked to participate in ATF's high-profile raids, and that was why he was now sitting in his government car with blacked-out windows on a Tulsa street, waiting for his agents and the news crews to arrive. It did not take long. In a few minutes, as several large vans with their sirens screaming pulled up in front of John Lawmaster's house, 30 black-clothed agents carrying machine guns, cutting tools, and a battering ram emerged from the vehicles. Patrons of the Sonic fast food restaurant across the street stared as 18 of the men prepared to smash the front door while the rest ran around the back of the house. On three, Agent Ward commanded. 1, 2, 3. The dry wood of the front door made a sound like several small caliber gunshots as it splintered under the onslaughts of the 300-pound ram. Neighbors watched in horrified fascination as John Lawmaster's front door was torn off its hinges and the black-clad invader streamed into the empty house. The ATF agents pulled out or tore open every drawer, shelf, and cabinet in every room in the house and dumped the contents into the center of the floor. They broke through walls looking for potential hiding spots. They tore tiles out of the ceiling. Finally, they cut the locks off Lawmaster's gun safes and threw every firearm in the safes out on the floor. One of the guns was a Colt AR-15, a lightweight rifle Eugene Stoner had designed for the Armalite division of Fairchild Aircraft 35 years earlier, now made by Colt Industries in Hartford, Connecticut. Supervisory Agent Ward picked up the rifle, opened it, and inspected the mechanism carefully. Shit, no M16 parts, he said to himself, and tossed the weapon back on the floor. Check the shed out back, and then that motorhome, Ward commanded, in spite of the fact that neither was listed on the search warrant. 2 agents, one with a pair of bolt cutters, ran out the door. They were met by a Channel 7 news crew that had arrived on the scene. The cameraman got some quick footage of the destruction inside the house before he filmed the agents breaking into John Lawmaster's tool shed and throwing the man's tools and fishing equipment out in the yard. Nothing here, the first agent said. Undeterred, he examined the lock on the motorhome. Bring that sledge over, he asked his companion. Hang on, that's mine, Lawmaster's neighbor said quickly. He had been watching the proceedings with undisguised astonishment. I got the key right here, he added helpfully. He did not mention that he was also the owner of the house and that Lawmaster was renting it from him. You his neighbor, the agent demanded? Yeah, my name's... Has Lawmaster got an AR-15? The agent interrupted. Yeah, the neighbor answered, momentarily taken aback by the unexpected question. Unless he sold it. The agent grinned. He knew John Lawmaster owned an AR-15, for he had seen Ward inspect it. And he has an auto-sear and M16 parts for it, doesn't he? The agent demanded. An auto-sear was a machined piece of steel about the size of 2 sugar cubes. When combined with 5 M16 specific Colt parts, an auto-sear enabled an AR-15 to fire full auto. ATF had banned the manufacture of unregistered auto-sears in 1981 by ruling that any of these half-ounce chunks of steel made after that date would by themselves be classified as machine guns. ATF had banned the manufacture of registered ones 5 years later, except, of course, for government agencies. ATF had further ruled that if one of these 6 pieces of steel, i.e. a loose M16 trigger, were possessed by a person who also owned an AR-15, it was a felony, regardless of whether the part was installed in the gun and despite the fact that all 6 items had to be present to make the gun function. I don't know, his neighbor shot back as he glared at the Fed. The agent stared at the cap the man wore, which was imprinted with the logo of a local pistol range. Lapse of memory, huh? He nodded at the cap. You're one of them. You don't know what an auto-sear is? I know exactly what an auto-sear is, the man said irritably. I don't know if John Lawmaster owns one or not. The agent turned on his heel and joined the other ATF men. The 30 agents systematically destroyed almost everything inside John Lawmaster's home. They searched in vain for any NFA-regulated article on which Lawmaster owed but had not paid the $200 NFA-mandated tax. Royster, Ward, and the other ATF agents did not find one single such weapon because John Lawmaster did not own any NFA-regulated weapons, taxed or otherwise. Sorry there was no story, Ward said to the film crew. His voice carried more than a trace of irritation. He had promised the news people that his men would find illegal guns in the home of the federally licensed Tulsa dealer, but he had let the media people down. The ATF men who had devastated the inside of John Lawmaster's house had carried machine guns as they conducted their raid. Not one agent or any of his superiors had paid any taxes on any of those NFA-regulated weapons. Not one agent had been made to undergo an exhaustive FBI records check and get a local police chief to sign a transfer form. Not one of the agents or any of his superiors had paid the $500 special occupational tax that people such as Henry Bowman were forced to pay annually in order to buy or sell NFA weapons without paying the $200 per weapon fee. Not one of the agents or his superiors kept a bound book listing the seller, the seller's license number, and the date of acquisition of the machine guns they carried, as someone such as Henry Bowman had to do. Not one of the agents or his superiors would ever be charged with the crime of failing to maintain such a bound book as someone such as Henry Bowman would have been. The agents did not have to worry about any of these failings. They didn't have to. They worked for the government. The ATF operations commander scribbled the words, "Nothing taken, ATF," on a piece of paper, dropped it on the floor, and called his men to gather up their things and return to headquarters. He and the other ATF agents left Lawmaster's house with the front door broken off its hinges, his safes cut open, and all his guns lying in piles in the middle of the devastated residence. John Lawmaster was never charged with any crime. All right, we're on page 462 of the hardback. January 6th, 1992. I don't get it with the broad, Sal. Why give him a piece first? What's the point? Mikey Mike's going to do this one, become a made man. I know the kid's got big balls, but Fat Tony Ferrato ain't exactly some runner with sticky fingers like most of the guys learn on. Up to me, I'd bring in a mechanic and who cares about paying the extra 20 G's. But Carmine says his son Mikey Mike has to do it. So, okay, I understand. It's a pride thing. I respect that. But this is my territory. Fat Tony never minded getting wet, and I know he ain't forgot how. Mikey Mike gets iced here. I look bad. Don't matter, Carmine said it was the kids' play. Don't matter, I said, let us handle it, and Carmine said no. I still look bad, so I softened Fat Tony up a little first. Let him have Cindy, get him relaxed, keep his mind on pussy and not on the fact I still got a lot going on with Carmine. Sal, Fat Tony like to hurt broads when he fucks them? Shit, 9-ball, who doesn't? Slam it in hard when they ain't quite ready? You and me both done that lots of times. Sal, Fat Tony likes to hurt broads when he fucks them, like by cutting them. He licks their blood, for Christ's sakes. Sometimes he burns them with cigarettes while he's doing it. Bit halfway through some whore's lip in Atlantic City. Sal Marino looked pained. Sick fucking bastard. There's no knife on him. He was clean for the meat. Rules of etiquette dictated no weapons of any kind were allowed during territorial negotiations. The same rules prohibited killing a rival while he was a guest in your home. That meant that Fat Tony Ferrato was safe as long as he was inside the building. This was why he had 2 hardmen waiting for him outside the front door. Should have given him someone else, Sal. We got a doc full time, for Christ's sake, just 2 floors down. Any burns or bruises, he'll take care of her. Anyway, it'll be the last time Fat Tony ever pulls that kind of shit. Cindy Caswell saw it coming long in advance, and she tried to defuse it. Fat Tony Ferrato was not the first man she'd encountered in the last 3 years who had not been able to enjoy himself unless he was hurting her. Others had slapped her, bit her, jerked her hair, and in one case, punched her in the stomach hard enough to make her vomit blood. Cindy had learned to move with the slaps. She had learned to endure the bites until the pain was severe, then deliver an ear-splitting shriek to stop the man from continuing. She had learned that if she moved her head so that when her hair was jerked, it was pulled in the rear, it almost didn't hurt at all. She had learned to do all these things while at the same time coaxing more arousal out of whomever she had been commanded to pleasure. Cindy Caswell realized in the first 30 seconds with the man now in front of her that she was in serious danger, but all of her experience was proving useless. Most men stroked themselves or reached for her when she came to them. The first thing Fat Tony had done after she had undressed entirely was to lick his lips. That was not unusual. The second thing he had done was to take her left nipple in a firm grip between his thumb and forefinger of his right hand. That was not unusual either. The third thing he had done was to try to tear it off. Cindy had remained silent, but her eyes watered furiously. She realized now that the only reason Ferrato had not succeeded was that she always rubbed her skin with almond oil before she presented herself to a new master. In spite of the oil, she felt that the man had almost drawn blood. She knew that at the very minimum, Anthony Joseph Ferrato was going to leave her with permanent scars. Oh my, Cindy said in a husky voice as her eyes wanted and she frantically tried to think of a way through this crisis. You're a man that wants a girl to remember him. You will, Fat Tony assured her. When she heard those two words, Cindy Caswell made a decision. She knew she was probably writing her own death warrant. Had it been 3 years earlier or 2 years earlier, or perhaps even only 1 year earlier, she might have decided otherwise. She might have elected to alternately beg and scream and endure whatever outrages the syndicate man inflicted upon her flesh while hoping that someone would come stop him before he killed her. She might have chosen acquiescence then, but now she did not. Cindy Caswell had been the personal sex slave of Salvatore Xavier Marino for 3.5 years. For all but the first few months of that time period, she had been a perk for whomever the mid-level mafioso wanted to keep happy. Her services were required twice a week on average. Sal had made it clear that so long as she performed this duty adequately, she would continue to have her own suite in the hotel, room service meals, cable television, and elegant clothes to wear when they went out. As soon as her performance was not up to expectations, Sal had explained, the organization would have no more use for her. There were hints that if age eventually diminished her appeal, she would be given a job in the casino with a bank account as a retirement bonus. Cindy did not for 1 second believe this would ever happen. Sal himself liked variety, so after the first 2 months, he rarely had sex with Cindy Caswell. One thing Sal Marino never grew tired of, however, was watching two women in bed together. On many evenings when she was not otherwise occupied, he would call Cindy into the bedroom to introduce her to whatever young woman was there with him. Women were safe, Cindy quickly learned, and sometimes she was almost able to forget that Sal Marino was even there. For the first year, Cindy had concentrated on staying alive. In the second year, she had looked for every possible avenue of escape and concluded that there was none. She could not possibly get out of Vegas before the word was put out that she was spotted. Cindy was forced to admit that she probably couldn't even get out of the hotel. In the third year, Cindy Caswell had decided that she would endure her servitude for as long as possible. But when it became intolerable, she was going to die with her own self-respect intact. She was not going to die alone. Cindy Caswell was not permitted to have anything in her room which would effectively be used as a weapon. When room service delivered meals, a single knife was included, and it was always removed with the dishes. Every time she went out with Sal or one of his guests, she was expertly frisked after dinner by one of his soldiers. After years without ever finding anything, she thought Sal would abandon the practice, but he had not. 5 months before, Cindy Caswell had taken to wearing her hair up in a chignon. She pinned her thick brown tresses in place with two tapered wooden dowels that looked like chopsticks, only a bit shorter. The first day, she had come out of the salon with the new coiffure. Two 2-inch sections of wood were plainly visible angling out of the knot in the back of her head. No one had thought anything of it. Over a 1-month period, Cindy Caswell had used several paper emery boards, altering the taper of the two dowels and making their tips much sharper. The change was gradual, so no one had noticed that either. Cindy's hair was held up with two tapered hardwood dowels as she stood naked in front of Fat Tony Ferrato. She turned her body slightly to the left, presenting him with her right breast. "Please don't ignore this one," she breathed. Fat Tony obliged her by savagely twisting her right nipple as he had her left. "Oh!" she exclaimed, trying to make her cry of pain sound like one of sexual release. She saw the man was now fully erect inside his slacks. "I'm only going to get one shot at this," she told herself. "Better do it right now while he's just been aroused." "Bed," she sighed. "Let's get in bed." Cindy Caswell led Anthony Ferrato to the king-size bed. He allowed her to push him onto his back, remove his shoes, and unzip his trousers. Cindy climbed astride the obese mafioso, saying, "I want you to watch how wet I get when you spank my bottom." She moved her body up his so that she was kneeling with her thighs on either side of the fat man's neck. Her vagina was 2 inches from the tip of his nose. "I shaved it for you so you could watch." Fat Tony swung his right arm and slammed the palm of his hand into the girl's bottom, but he had no leverage at that angle, and the impact had little force. Cindy moved slightly with the blow and let her pelvic area cover more of the man's face. "Harder," she demanded, arching her back, tightening the muscles in her thighs and throwing her hips forward. Fat Tony's eyes were now covered by Cindy Caswell's crotch. When she looked down, she could see only the top of the man's forehead and his oily black hair. Only got a couple of seconds, she thought. Slap my ass, she said, breathing in hard. Anthony Ferrato was not going to try to slap Cindy's bottom. He had something else in mind. Cindy Caswell pulled one of the tapered maple dowels from the coil of hair at the back of her head, seated the dowel's flat end into the palm of her right hand, and made a fist. The sharpened end stuck out 5 inches between the knuckles of Cindy's second and third fingers. She felt Fat Tony's hand reach up and grab her hip bones. One shot, girl, Cindy said to herself. Gotta lift yourself straight off this bed. She gripped the back of her right hand in the palm of her left, then pulled her hands in until her thumbs touched her abdominal muscles. With the tapered wooden spike pointing straight down, she knew instinctively that the man was about to pull her down onto his mouth so that he could bite off her labia. Fat Tony pulled his lips back to expose his teeth, dropped his jaw, and used all of his considerable might to pull the girl towards his waiting mouth. Cindy sat back slightly, and as soon as she saw the man's eyebrows come into view below the swell of her pubic mound, she drove the wooden shaft straight down with all of the strength in both her arms. Anthony Ferrato had just started to close his jaw on Cindy Caswell's vaginal lips when the point of the sharpened maple spike entered the top of his left eye socket. With 113 pounds of force behind it, the small wooden lance passed between the bone and the top of his eyeball, pushing the optic nerve aside and drove straight through the man's brain. In less than 0.03 of a second, the sharpened wooden tip bottomed on the inside back of Anthony Ferrato's skull and blunted itself as it slammed into the bone. Cindy Caswell, her system charged with adrenaline, locked her elbows, flexed her shoulders forward, and put every ounce of weight on her palms, and did indeed manage to momentarily lift her knees off the bed. Most of Fat Tony's right side went numb, and some of his voluntary motor functions on that side were shut down as if a huge switch had been thrown. His left eyeball was rotated upwards, but the vision in his right eye was still good. When Cindy Caswell got off his chest, he thought he could see something sticking out of his head just left of his nose. His left eye hurt, but other than that, there was little pain. He was trying to figure out what was going on and why the girl was smiling at him. Cindy Caswell reached for the protruding end of the wood spike. She saw with satisfaction that Fat Tony's good eye followed the movement of her hand. Cindy gripped the end of the round maple spike and pulled. The tapered dowel started to come free, and she stopped after she had withdrawn it about an inch. With her left hand, she grabbed the man's still rigid penis, threw her leg over his hips, and sank into his erection. An unintelligible sound came from Fat Tony Ferrato. "You like that, huh?" she said with a smile as she rocked back and forth on him. To Fat Tony, her voice sounded as if there were a big steel drum, but he heard what she said. She picked up the pace and realized with surprise that she was close to climax. "Don't look so surprised, Mr. Ferrato," Cindy chided as she reached once more for the protruding end of the wooden dowel. "Sal told you I was going to fuck your brains out." As she felt the first wave of her orgasm start to course through her body, Cindy Caswell grabbed the end of the dowel, closed her eyes, and stirred vigorously. "Hey, Tony, you still in there?" Sal Marino looked at his companions, then swore under his breath. "They've been in there for hours. You hear water running? 9-ball, or is that my ears?" "No, it's water. Probably taking a shower, wash the blood off," he said darkly. "Christ, don't say that," Sal blurted out. The other man shrugged. Sal Marino shook his head and came to a decision. "Give me the pass key." Marino took his key, used it to open the door, and peered inside. He closed it softly and turned to his companion. There was a smile on his face. "Fat Tony's in the bed under the covers. Must be sleeping. So that's Cindy in the shower. I guess she worked her charm on him, huh?" "I guess so, Sal. What do we do now?" "Hell, let's hit the tables. He'll probably want to go for seconds when he wakes up. Let him have some fun. It's got to last him a long time." The other man laughed at that and followed Marino to the elevator. August 21st, 1992. "You three know where you're going?" Deputy Marshal Arthur T. Roderick Jr. asked the members of the three-man team. "The North Peak?" "Yeah, no problem." "Looks like it's going to be a hot one. You guys going to wear body armor along with all the camo gear?" one of the group asked. "Screw that. It's a big enough pain in the ass we got to lug around all this other shit every day, especially in the heat." That's the truth. The 6 deputy marshals all decided to forego body armor that day. What was going on that morning was nothing new. Federal marshals from the U.S. Marshal Service has been spying on the Weaver house for 18 months, ever since Weaver had failed to show up for his court date in February of 1991. For the first year, the Weaver mission had been run by the Northern Idaho office of the U.S. Marshal Service. In March of 1992, however, control of the federal operation was handed over to the Marshal Service headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, 2,000 miles away. In that month, Deputy Marshal Arthur T. Roderick, Jr., a member of the Marshal Service Special Operations Group, was sent from Arlington headquarters to Idaho to take command of the Weaver operation. Roderick was heading a 6-man unit. He had split the group into 3-man teams. One team's job was to watch the Weaver cabin from the distant vantage point of a mountain peak. The other team, which included Roderick, planned to penetrate the dense woods immediately below Randy Weaver's house. The other 2 members of Roderick's team were William Deegan and Larry Cooper. Although Roderick himself had made over 24 clandestine trips to the area around Weaver's cabin in the past 6 months, Deegan and Cooper were new to this part of the operation. Roderick's plan was to move an undercover agent into the land adjacent to Weaver's and, over the next few months, have him gain Randy Weaver's confidence. Deegan and/or Cooper were potential choices for this role, and Roderick intended to familiarize them both with Weaver's property and the land around it. All set? Arthur Roderick asked. Yeah, I guess. Hope it doesn't get too hot with all this gear. The 3 men on the penetration team wore camouflage over their entire bodies. On their heads were night vision goggles. In their packs, they carried still cameras, movie cameras, and electronics gear for surveillance. Clipped to their harnesses were secure voice radios. Roderick, Deegan, and Cooper each carried both a pistol and a machine gun. Roderick and Deegan had Colt M16s, while Cooper's machine gun was a 9mm with a sound suppressor. Between the 3 of them, the marshals were carrying 4 NFA weapons, 3 machine guns, and a silencer. None of the 3 men had filled out any registration forms or paid any taxes on any of the 4 NFA weapons they carried, nor were any of the agents special occupational taxpayers. Randy Weaver had been under constant federal surveillance for 18 months. The cost of this operation would exceed what the government would spend on intelligence gathering before the invasion of Haiti. Federal agents carrying machine guns and over $50,000 worth of surveillance gear, but no search or arrest warrants, were once again about to invade Weaver's property. All this was due to the feds' claim that a piece of wood had been 3/8 of an inch too short and Weaver had not paid a $5 tax on it. The appalling irony of this situation was lost on Deputy Marshal Roderick, Deegan, and Cooper. Oh shit, Larry Cooper said. The 3 of them were in the woods below the Weaver family cabin. It was a little before 11 a.m. in the morning, and a dog had just started barking. Must have caught our scent, William Deegan said. Let's get out of here, Arthur Roderick suggested. Your machine gun has a silencer, he said to Cooper. Shoot the dog. The 3 heavily armed deputy marshals began to run down the hill. Sounds like strikers found a deer, Kevin Harris said to Sammy Weaver. Harris was a 25-year-old logger, a family friend who spent much of his time at the Weaver cabin. Sammy and Kevin grabbed their rifles from the wall rack and ran out the door towards the sound of Sammy's yellow Labrador retriever. As the dog approached, the 3 Freds crouched down in the heavy brush and remained still. They were all but invisible, for they wore not only camouflage clothing from head to toe, but also camo face paint. The 3 men watched as the dog approached. The yellow lab was much more of a pet than a guard dog. Stryker had been around people all his life, and because of the constant federal surveillance, the land around the Weaver cabin had been loaded with traces of human scent for over a year. The dog had a good nose for birds and animals, but human scent did not set him off. Stryker had started barking not because he had smelled the deputy marshals, but because he had heard them moving through the brush below the house. Now they were silent. Roderick, Deegan, and Cooper watched as the dog approached where they were hidden. Sammy Weaver and Kevin Harris followed about 60 yards behind the yellow lab. No point in shooting now, Cooper thought, as the dog walked past the hiding place and continued down the mountain. The lab was no threat, and the 9mm machine gun Cooper carried, even with its sound suppressor, would easily be heard by the 2 approaching young men. Best to wait here until they all go away, Cooper told himself as he watched the dog walk away from him and his two companions. Larry Cooper was completely unprepared for what happened next. Why doesn't he kill it? Deputy Marshal Arthur Roderick thought as the Labrador passed by their hiding place. Sammy Weaver and Kevin Harris were almost to the three agents when Roderick stood up, flipped the selector lever of his M16 to semi, shouldered the rifle, and shot Weaver's dog in the rear. The animal yelped once loudly enough to be heard over the rifle's tremendous muzzle blast, then died. Its spine had been shattered by the high-velocity rifle bullet. "Sammy! Kevin, what's going on?" Randy Weaver shouted from above when he heard the shot. Sammy Weaver and Kevin Harris were taken utterly by surprise as the sound of the .223 blasted in their ears. The Weaver boy had been watching Stryker, and when he saw his dog killed, he whirled towards the source of the shot and instinctively fired 2 quick rounds from his rifle in that general direction, then ran towards the cabin. Neither shot hit anything other than brush. "I'm coming, Dad," the boy yelled. He had taken 3 steps before 2 rifle bullets slammed into him. The first struck him in the upper arm, very nearly severing the limb from his body. The second hit him in the back. Sammy Weaver's legs carried him 2 more steps before he fell on his face dead. He had just recently turned 14. Randy Weaver, up on an adjacent logging road, was carrying a shotgun when he heard the shots ring out. A shotgun was useless at that distance, so he started firing the weapon in the air as he ran towards the cabin. He hoped to distract the feds from Sammy and Kevin and allow the 2 boys to escape. Randy Weaver did not realize that his son was already dead. Kevin Harris watched in horror as the boy he had known for 9 years died before his eyes. Instinctively, with his rifle held at waist level, Harris fired from the hip at the man who had killed Sammy, then turned and ran. Kevin Harris proved to be more proficient at point shooting than his young friend had been. The bullet hit Deegan in the rib cage, smashing several ribs and exiting behind his armpit. The bullet caused massive trauma and hemorrhage into Deegan's lung, killing the man. Kevin Harris made it back to the cabin safely. As a terrified Roderick and Cooper stayed hidden in the bushes, the weather turned colder and it started to rain. The 2 deputy marshals huddled by the body of their dead companion, shivering in the cold rain as they waited for someone to come save them. Finally, after nightfall, an Idaho State Police SWAT team rescued the 2 men and recovered the dead marshal's corpse. When sworn testimony was taken, Roderick and Cooper would repeat their initial statements that they had made to the FBI. The 2 men said that Harris had fired the first shot, hitting Deegan in the chest, and only after Harris had killed their fellow marshal did the 2 feds return fire. There would be several problems with this claim. The first was that both 14-year-old Sammy Weaver and his yellow Labrador had been shot from behind. The second was that if Harris had fired the first shot of the firefight killing Deegan, it was certainly an odd response for Roderick to shoot the dog and let the young man who had just killed his partner get away. The final and most troubling fact that did not square with the marshal's claim was that 7 pieces of .223 brass would be found next to where Deegan's corpse had fallen. These fired cases had come from Deegan's M16, which, according to Deputy Marshal Cooper's sworn testimony, had been set on semi-auto when Cooper later picked it up. William Deegan had fired 7 shots before he died. Many would claim that Deegan could only have fired these rounds before Kevin Harris fired the single shot that tore through Deegan's chest and killed the marshal. Others quickly countered that Deegan had held his fire, then pulled the trigger of his weapon 7 times as fast as he could before falling down dead. Another deputy marshal, a man named Jack Clough, would do his part to exonerate Marshals Roderick and Cooper by giving the Salt Lake Tribune yet another version of what had happened that morning. In an article that the Utah newspaper published 2 weeks later, Clough explained that after Deegan had been shot, Roderick and Cooper dove into a natural depression in the ground, held their guns overhead, and cranked off rounds blindly in front of them. Presumably, Samuel Weaver was killed in the exchange. Though Clough would fail to mention it, presumably the dog was also killed in this panicked spray and pray maneuver. Clough would also fail to mention how he came by this proprietary knowledge about the incident, given that he was not present when the shooting occurred. Midnight was approaching as Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris went back down to the mountainside to retrieve the body of Randy's 14-year-old son. Randy wrapped the body in a sheet, and the 2 men carried it up the hill, then laid it out in a shed near the cabin. As Randy looked at the mud and blood-stained corpse, he thought his heart would break. Randy Weaver did not realize that things were about to get a lot worse. August 22nd, 1992. This is not good at all, FBI agent Alex Newman thought to himself as he surveyed the mountain terrain around him. Newman was a member of the FBI's hostage rescue team, or HRT, pronounced HURT. He had been with the Bureau for 18 years, and he had never seen anything like what was happening now. More than 300 law enforcement officers from both federal and state agencies had swarmed into the area since Marshal Deegan had been killed the previous morning. These agents that surrounded the Weaver residence wore camouflage clothing and face paint and were armed with machine guns and sniper rifles. Along with the hundreds of armed police agents was an impressive array of vehicles and other equipment. There was a huge command post set up on a neighbor's property, complete with satellite links, communication trailers, motorhomes, and wall tents. There were 14 Humvees, 2 armored personnel carriers, 3 2.5-ton cargo trucks, 2 medvac helicopters, 1 Hughes surveillance helicopter, 2 Army field kitchens, 6 water trailers, and 4 field generators. The aerial photos that the agents were using had been taken by an Air Force F-4 Phantom pilot. I don't want to be part of this, Newman told himself for perhaps the 10th time. No way they're going to get out alive now. All wood cabin up on the hill, sun ought to be out before long. Everything will be dry in a few days. This many agents? The man felt an overwhelming sense of dread about what was to come. I don't want to be here when they burn this guy and his family alive. The HRT man was thinking of the 1974 raid in California, when he had only been with the Bureau for 3 months. There, the Bureau's final assault on the so-called Symbionese Liberation Army had resulted in the fiery deaths of 5 people. He was also thinking of 1983, when the tax protester Gordon Wall of the Posse Comitatus had been burned to death by the Bureau. Newman was remembering the courses the FBI gave its agents on the use of fire to burn out adversaries. Maybe I can get a lateral transfer to Cheyenne, Wyoming, take a few cuts and benefits if I have to. I'm getting too old to watch this kind of shit anymore. As it turned out, although Alex Newman was right in his prediction of disaster for the family on the Hill, his fears of fire that morning were premature. Randy, Vicky, their 3 daughters, and Kevin Harris were indeed surrounded by hundreds of agents. Up on the mountain, they had some freedom of movement, however, and were not completely trapped in the cabin. The FBI did not elect to burn them out. Alex Newman would have to wait another 6 months before the Bureau would once again demonstrate its expertise with incendiaries. Special Agent Lon Hirochi of the FBI's hostage rescue team in Quantico, Virginia, was settled in behind the scope of his bolt-action .308 caliber police sniper rifle. The gun rested on sandbags and was aimed at Randy Weaver's cabin, about 200 yards away. It was close to 6 o'clock in the evening. Hirochi and the other FBI snipers had been watching the Weaver cabin for several hours, waiting for a target to present itself. He had already been given clearance to shoot. Randy Weaver sat at the kitchen table. He was thinking of his son, whose body lay in a shed outside. He heard one of his 2 remaining dogs barking and instinctively thought of Stryker, Sammy's yellow lab, who was also dead. Sounds like he's behind one of the sheds, Kevin Harris said to his friend. Probably smells Sammy, Randy Weaver said forlornly. He stood up and took a deep breath. I'm going to go check to make sure Sammy's body's okay. I'll go with you, Harris said. Me too, Dad, Sarah Weaver insisted. I want to see Sammy one more time. Randy Weaver started to protest, but Vicky, who was nursing their youngest daughter, 10-month-old Elisheba, cut him off. Let her go, Randy. Her husband nodded. Sarah Weaver, who at 16 was Randy and Vicky's eldest child, followed her father and Kevin Harris out the cabin door. Clear to fire, came the FBI order when Randy, Kevin, and Sarah came out of the cabin and started hurrying towards the shed. One FBI sniper waited until Randy stopped at the door to the shed, then the federal man pulled the trigger. Randy Weaver was reaching up to unlatch the shed door when the sniper's bullet creased his right armpit and slammed into the shed. Randy's other hand flew to the site of the wound as the muzzle blast rang out over the mountainside. "Daddy, get back in the house," screamed Sarah Weaver as she grabbed her father and began pushing him back towards the cabin. Kevin Harris followed quickly after his 2 friends. Vicky Weaver, still nursing the 10-month-old, she cradled in one arm, held the kitchen door open for Randy, Sarah, and Kevin. "You bastards!" Vicky screamed as the last of the 3, Kevin Harris, ran past her into the kitchen. It was then that Agent Hirochi of the hostage rescue team pulled the trigger and fired the shot that would make him famous. The bullet struck Vicky Weaver squarely in the temple. Brain matter and large skull fragments were blasted out the opposite side of her head as the heavy .30 caliber slug exited her skull and continued on, tearing through Kevin Hart's left arm and smashing 2 of his ribs before finally lodging in his chest. Vicki Weaver's corpse collapsed on the floor, clutching the baby in a rictus of death. Sarah Weaver turned at the sound of the impact and took in the grisly scene. Her mother was obviously dead. Part of her head was gone. Kevin Harris's arm was torn open and he had a bad-looking chest wound. He was doubled over trying to get his breath, for his lung was collapsing. Her father, Sarah believed, was seriously wounded from Hirochi's first shot. Sarah Weaver looked for the baby and realized Elisheba was under her mother's lifeless body, still clutched in the dead woman's arms. Sarah grabbed her mother's corpse by the shoulder and pulled it over enough so that the baby would not be smothered, and then rushed to her wounded father. In a space of 36 hours, federal agents had killed Randy Weaver's wife and also his son. The FBI would claim that Hirochi had been authorized to shoot because when Randy, Sarah, and Kevin had come out of the cabin, they were about to open fire on a surveillance helicopter hovering overhead. One problem with this claim was that several government witnesses testified that when Hirochi fired the shot that creased Weaver's armpit, Randy Weaver was reaching to unlatch the shed door. He was not and could not have been shooting at a helicopter. The killing of Vicki Weaver was much harder to justify. The 2 men and the girl had been running into the relative safety of the cabin, and they had already gotten inside when Hirochi fired his fatal second shot. No one could claim that the 3 were doing anything aggressive. They were simply running for their lives. Furthermore, Randy Weaver had been the first one in the door. No one could make a credible claim that the hostage rescue specialist had been shooting at him. The official report would be that Hirochi had been trying to shoot Kevin Harris in the back as he ran into the kitchen, but had been late with the shot and then jerked the trigger. That was why the agent had shot the nursing mother in the head, purely by accident. It was also pure luck that Kevin Harris had been seriously wounded in the process. "What do you suppose they're doing up there?" one of the agents asked as he looked up the hill at the cabin. "Why don't they come out? The mother's dead. You'd think they'd give up." "I'm getting tired of standing here in the rain," his friend said. "Let's see if we can get a rise out of anyone up there." The agent cupped his hands to make a megaphone for his voice. "Vicky! Oh, Vicky! What are you going to cook for us for breakfast tomorrow? Vicky, your husband loves it when you cook for him, doesn't he? Have you got enough for everybody? Vicky!" The agent shook his head and chuckled. "Guess it's not going to work. Try again later," his friend suggested. Wow. "I hate this job," Alex Newman thought, as he stood in the cold rain and watched the scene in front of him. He was standing by the barricaded Ruby Creek Bridge, 4 miles below the Weaver cabin, where dozens of state and federal officers faced an angry mob of area residents and friends of the Weavers. Included in the group were Kevin Harris's parents. The situation was more volatile than anything that Newman had experienced in 18 years with the FBI. The feds had set up a barricade that morning to deny access to Weaver's property and had evicted over 30 nearby residents from their homes, some of them at gunpoint. The people absolutely hated the massive federal invasion. They were demanding answers and they weren't getting any. Thank God they don't know about that dead boy, Newman thought. Yet. The veteran FBI man stood up straight in the cold rain and kept his face from showing any of what he felt inside. He had not yet heard about what had happened to Vicki Weaver 5 hours earlier. September 19th, 1992. Good afternoon. My name's Henry Bowman, and I'm an alcoholic. "Hi, Henry," a chorus of people replied simultaneously. I swear that's the most moronic part of this whole organization, Henry thought with an inward smile, but I guess I'd miss it if they didn't do it. Maybe. He cleared his throat and went on. There were about 20 people sitting in front of him in the church rectory. "It's been a while since I came to a meeting. A couple things have happened lately that made me realize it would be a good idea to find one and go. One of them was that I'm the sponsor of this young guy who just got out of a chemical dependency program at one of the hospitals, and he wanted to talk to me about something they'd gone over in class. One of the counselors was talking about secrets about things in our past we're ashamed of. He was saying to the class that these things have a lot of power over us, mainly because they're secret, not because of what they are. Anyway, This kid told me that some of the people in his class had volunteered to tell some secrets about themselves, and after they did, they seemed to feel a lot better for having done it. Only he couldn't bring himself to, in front of all those people. So he asked me if he could tell me his secret, which would be easier for him than fessing up in front of a whole bunch of people, some of them women. I guess I was kind of a practice run. Most of the people in the room laughed at that moment. I said, sure, and was hoping it would be something interesting because it had been a slow day. But he ended up telling me about how he'd stolen something worth about $10 from someone a long time ago, and he was really ashamed because the person was his best friend. We talked about it some, and he seemed to feel a lot better. And if I was disappointed because the secret was really boring, I tried not to let on. A few more people chuckled at that. After I hung up, I got to thinking about the whole secrets thing, and did I still have any? Came to realize there was one. I'd never thought of it in this way the kid had, because it wasn't something bad I'd done to somebody while I was drinking. It was something that happened to me 21 years ago when I was cold sober and my drinking consisted of maybe a glass of champagne at Christmas. Henry Bowman went on to tell the group about the summer night in 1971 that he had been gang raped while out running. He told the story quickly and without embellishment. He was surprised at how easy it was. Maybe the counselor at the program is on to something, Henry thought. When he finished the story, several people were looking at the floor. There was one woman, however, who could not take her eyes off Henry. That was 21 years ago. It was the real start of my drinking, and I was just lucky that someone took me to an AA meeting before I got into some disaster that couldn't be reversed. After I got sober, I started teaching personal self-defense classes using what I had learned. I told all of my students about what happened. Only thing is, I lied. I told them it was a severe beating, which it definitely was, but I left the sex part out of it. The classes were a success, and I have received letters over the years from former students saying that what they learned from me kept them alive and unhurt when they were attacked. Thing is, why did I lie? It wasn't because I'd done anything wrong. I hadn't committed a crime. You could argue that it wasn't my duty to air dirty linen in public, except I didn't tell anybody what really happened, not for over 20 years, not until right now. I haven't had a drink for 17 years. Some things are happening right now that make me feel powerless, very much like the way I felt that night in 1971. And I really wanted a drink last night. Henry paused and shook his head. I take that back. I didn't want one drink last night. I wanted a full bottle of gin and about a quart of fresh tonic water and a whole lime to slice up and a place to drink it with no phone and no television. But I knew if I did that, I'd have the same set of problems today, along with a great big new one, losing 20 years of sobriety. So I ate an ice cream cone instead and came here tonight. One by one, many of the people in the group thanked Henry for what he had said and related something they had gotten out of hearing it. Several told secrets about themselves. Henry thought they were all pretty mundane, except for one member's confession that after he had been fired from his job for drinking, he'd had a printer run off some labels for a wear-reducing engine additive, slapped one on a can of lapping compound, and sent it off with a "here's your free sample" letter on dummied-up Valvoline letterhead to his ex-boss. The man's Mercedes had gone almost a whole week before the entire engine was ruined. "You sure your boss didn't keep a bottle of gin in his desk?" Henry asked when he heard the story. "I wouldn't dump some strange crap in my engine if the letter that came with it was from God himself." "I'd like to speak with you for a few minutes," the young woman said to Henry. "I haven't had dinner yet, and the coffee shop down the street has good milkshakes, if you like ice cream," Henry smiled. "Sure, I could go for that. I'm sorry if you said your name before. I didn't catch it." "No, it's only my 4th or 5th meeting here. We've never met, and I didn't say anything tonight. My name's Cindy Caswell." The two shook hands, and Cindy led the way to the door. "There's a secret I have that I wasn't quite ready to tell the whole group," Cindy said after they had been seated and had ordered their food. "I think you might understand, so I'd like to talk to you about it." Henry nodded his head, and Cindy Caswell told him about her abduction and subsequent 3-year ordeal in Las Vegas. When she got to the part about Fat Tony Ferrato, she told Henry that her last assignment had been an overweight man who'd had a heart attack during sex. She said she'd taken the considerable sum of money he'd had in his pocket, which was true, and managed to get out of town before anyone knew he was dead. Cindy Caswell was not about to confess to murder, not to someone from an AA meeting or to anyone else. She did, however, mention the date of the event, and Henry Bowman made a mental note of it. So you went through all that for 3 years straight in Las Vegas, but didn't start drinking until you got back here? Henry asked after the waitresses brought the milkshakes and Cindy's hamburger. He was reserving judgment on the story the girl had told him. Alcoholics tended to lie when it suited their purpose, just like the rest of the population. There, I didn't have a choice. I might as well have been kept in a cage. When I got back here, well, she let the sentence hang. So why AA? He asked critically as he sipped his milkshake. You don't look too bad off to me, and it certainly didn't seem you were all too keen to being at the meeting tonight. Judge's orders. I wrecked a car when I was drunk. Just an old junker. Ran it off the road into the woods. No one hurt. But I totaled it. And when the police came and I was babbling, they did a test and came up more than double the limit. It was AA or women's detention. And sometimes it seems to you that all the higher power stuff is a bunch of Jehovah's Witness crap, right? Let go and let God, serenity prayers and all that? Exactly. Well, Henry said as he took a deep breath, I got news for you. It is. What? She exclaimed, putting down her hamburger. It is a bunch of crap if you look at it that way. Simplistic phrases repeated endlessly by people who probably got shorted in the genetic lottery to begin with. Not apt to engender confidence in the program, if that's what you're focusing on. But there are a lot of good people in AA that just about anyone would look up to. Go talk to them. Find out what they get out of the program. Don't ask the sappy-sounding moron that says he's got his recovery all figured out when he's only been sober 3 weeks. And if you think you aren't an alcoholic, well, driving off into a tree doesn't strike me as normal behavior. You've got enough problems, like getting snatched off the street without making more trouble for yourself. Cindy nodded. So what works for you, she asked. Law of physics. That's my higher power. Energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. Immutable, constant. Stand in the way of a freight train, you get clobbered. All the good intentions or willpower or careful planning won't change the train's effect on your body. Same thing with alcohol. My body has a biochemical addiction to a drug, period. If I have one drink, I want another. I want another one a lot more than I wanted the first one. All the good intentions and careful planning can't change that. Other people may not have the biochemical addiction, but I do. Just like my cousin is allergic to penicillin. One injection and his heart stops beating. Mine chugs along with no problem. I can't change those things. Going to AA reminds me of that. Keeps me from thinking maybe the freight train won't hurt me if I'm real careful. It's also a chance for me to see just how good life is when you stay sober. Those people in there tonight, a lot of them had one foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel when they first came in, Henry chuckled. People been sober a month can't wait to tell everybody all their terrible things they did when they were drunk. People been sober a long time like to talk about all the great things that have happened since they stopped wandering around in a gin fog. I'd like you to be my sponsor, Cindy Caswell said suddenly. No, Henry Bowman said immediately, shaking his head. Bad idea. Opposite sex sponsors are strongly discouraged, and with good reason. Sexual tension is a real bad news tossed on top of recovery. More than a few of the young babes new to AA get 13th step by guys in the group. Some guys even go to AA meetings for that reason. They don't put that in the literature, Henry added. And being a girl's sponsor makes it that much easier, so no. As he was saying this, Cindy Caswell was shaking her head vigorously in disagreement. After those 3 years in Vegas, I don't have any desire for men. I much prefer women, so that wouldn't be a problem if you were my sponsor. Hell, that doesn't matter, Henry exclaimed. We're not talking about your sex drive. Jesus, it wasn't your urges that caused you 3 years of grief. He gave a short laugh. A few months after my little incident in Jefferson County, my interest in the female gender came back with a goddamn vengeance, and it's been that way ever since. Cindy Caswell laughed heartily when she heard this. That's good, she said with a smile. Yeah, no shit. Look, I don't really know anyone around here, Cindy asked, changing her tack. And things are kind of up in the air for me right now. Can I still call you to talk about stuff like we did tonight? Call you on the phone? Yeah, sure, that's okay. Henry pulled a business card out of his pocket, listing the consulting firm where he worked, and wrote his home number on the back. Don't worry about the time. I live alone and keep weird hours. I've got a roommate, but so do I. What about your family in Rolla? Henry asked suddenly. Have you seen them? Cindy Caswell looked distinctly uncomfortable at the question. I called there from a payphone, but the number had been disconnected. I guess they're gone. Why don't you just run down there? It's only a couple hours from here. You'd be sure to find someone you know. It's only been 4 years, right? I don't want to be seen. Sal knew I was from there. I'm not sure they're still alive now. He may have had them killed, because I ran away. That doesn't make any sense, Henry thought immediately. Go 2,000 miles to track down and kill the family of one of their captive whores because she took off after 3 years? Whole story's probably made up. White trash parents threw her out or something. Henry nodded as if agreeing with her. This Sal guy, Henry said, as if trying to remember. He wasn't the one who died, was he? Henry was hoping some more names would shake loose. No, that was Fat Tony. Sal Marino was the guy who told me who I had to screw. Fat Tony and Sal Marino, Henry thought. Sounds like a high school production of Guys and Dolls. Henry nodded and then changed the subject back to the AA meeting. He kept the two names filed in his memory. September 21st, 1992. Okay, I got some dope on those two you asked about Friday, Dean Copeland said over the long-distance phone line. I don't suppose you're going to tell me what this is about. Sure I am, Henry replied easily. Probably not today, but before too long, yes. Well, it looks like ancient history anyway. The Fat Tony you referred to would be one Anthony Ferrato of Atlantic City. Former up-and-comer in the organization with a nasty habit of disfiguring and crippling prostitutes. He was killed January 7th of this year in Las Vegas. January 6th, Henry thought. That's the date she told me he had a heart attack. Mr. Ferrato was shot 4 times with a 9mm, 3 times in the chest and once in the left eye. Winchester 115 grain full metal jacket, if that matters. His action in New Jersey was taken over by a Mr. Carmine Mangini, also of the Atlantic City area. The killing was done while Anthony Ferrato was in the back seat of his car. Killed along with him were 2 of his torpedoes, one of them in the driver's seat. All 3 of the men were bound hand and foot. Want the names of the other 2? No, that's okay, Henry said. You find anything about that Sal Marino? Yeah, he's in Vegas, mid-level type. Lives in a hotel, Henry heard papers rustling as Dean Copeland went through his notes. The Vegas Moon, he said when he found it. That's the name she told me, Henry thought. Marino's still around, but he's getting pressure from some of the mutts in California, and right now it looks like he's trying to keep his powder dry. Henry digested that and then asked another question of the Detroit detective. What's Marino's connection to the dead guy, Ferrato? Funny you should ask. Ferrato came to Vegas to talk business with Marino. Michael Mangini, known as Mikey Mike, and son of Carmine Mangini, was working as a kind of apprentice to Marino. A training program, you might say, with the intention of returning to Atlantic City after a period of time to work for his dad, which is exactly what he did as soon as the 3 guys turned up dead. And conventional wisdom has it that Mikey Mike made his bones on the hit. So the son shoots Ferrato and his 2 soldiers, and Dad takes over Ferrato's business. Sal Marino's still friends with Mangini. Was he in on it, you think? Yes, he still does a lot of business with Mangini, and it'd be a miracle if he wasn't involved in the killing. I see, Henry said, not understanding where Cindy Caswell fit into all this. Dean, was there anything strange about the whole thing, the killing, who did it? Anything like that? Anything that didn't look like a typical internal power grab? You tell me, Henry. There was a long pause, and then Henry Bowman sighed into the phone. Dean, the story I heard, told to me by someone who is afraid she's going to be hunted down and killed because of what she might have seen, is that this Ferrato guy did not die from being shot 4 times while tied up in the back of the limo. Bingo. I talked to the medical examiner, guy named Wong, no accent, probably 5th-generation American. Anyways, I called him because I thought I might get some useful dope on the wound ballistics for my database. Dean Copeland had gathered more empirical data than any other person in the country on real-world performance of handgun ammunition in gunfights. His findings were used more and more by serious individuals to dictate what loads they carried in their self-defense weapons. What he told me was very interesting. According to him, your Mr. Ferrato died quite some time before the other two men. It was also his best estimate that whatever killed Mr. Ferrato, it was not any of the 4 9mm Winchesters. Oh, Henry said, now even more interested. That's right. The wounds are consistent with the results we get when we fire into cadavers. The most interesting thing was the head wound. Wong autopsied Ferrato's brain, said the path of the bullet was obvious and that there was substantial trauma to the brain that absolutely could not have been caused by that one full metal jacketed bullet. He said he found minute wood particles, sawdust, you might say, in the damaged part of the brain that was away from the path of the bullet, ran them through a mass spectrometer, and came up with rock maple as the material. Why did this Ferrato's death merit such a big-time investigation, Henry asked. Dean Copeland laughed. I asked the same question. The short answer is it didn't. Far as the cops are concerned, Ferrato died same time as the other two, of multiple gunshot wounds. Mikey Mike did it, even though he has 100 witnesses saying he was somewhere else at the time. Case closed. No, this pathologist apparently takes great pride in doing as thorough a job as possible, even when nobody asks him to. He told me his lab partner in 10th grade chemistry class needled him once about making up the results to some experiment, and he's never forgotten it. There's one more thing he told me. Seems Ferrato was fortunate enough to get laid shortly before he died, although not fortunate enough to get off. The pathologist told you that? Henry demanded in amazement. Said any second-year med student could have called that one. Then I'm glad I went into geology, Henry thought a moment. The pathologist give you his opinion on what really happened if the guy didn't die from gunshots? Yes. He said that in his best judgment, Anthony Ferrato, either during or immediately after sexual intercourse, died while lying on his back from the effects of having a long wooden object, a long maple object to be exact, thrust into his eye socket and wiggled around enthusiastically. 8 to 12 hours later, his corpse was placed in the car and 4 shots were fired into him. You got a theory why he'd do it that way, Henry asked? Only one. The wise guys don't kill their competition in their own house. It's bad form. Also, they usually leave the soldiers alone when there's going to be a new boss. So why do it inside the hotel in the first place? Why not wait? That's the one that no one can answer right now. Henry was silent for a few moments before speaking. I may be able to give you a possible explanation before too long, if it means anything to you. Only academically, but yeah, I'd like to hear it, Copeland laughed. What other Detroit cop do you know that could get you the inside poop on a Vegas syndicate hit? You the man, Dean. You the man. Henry Bowman thought about the conversation for some time after Copeland broke the connection. September 23rd, 1992. I don't think Sal Marino's looking for you. What? I talked to a homicide cop I know with some good contacts in Las Vegas. Fat Tony Ferrato's body was found January 7th in the back of his car, shot once in the eye and 3 times in the chest. The bodies of both his guards were in the car with him. One of Sal Marino's buddies has taken over Ferrato's action in Atlantic City. Henry paused and then went on. Medical examiner said he'd been dead when the bullets were fired. My cop friend seems to think that Marino had already planned to have him killed. Then, when he died in the saddle, Marino set up the dummy murder scene. Did you order me a chocolate malt? Yes. Why? Cindy Caswell asked. I mean, why fake a shooting? Because having Ferrato expire in the hotel while he was Marino's guest is against the mafia rules of etiquette, apparently. Cindy Caswell thought for a while about that, then nodded her head in acceptance. Henry, she said, there's something I didn't You know about Joe Colombo's attempted murder? Henry broke in. What? No, who's that? One of the most instructive events in American history. A lawyer friend of mine thinks it should be taught in grade school. Here we go, Henry said as his malt was delivered. Damn, these are good, he said, savoring the first few sips. Where was I? Oh, yes, Joe Colombo and the guy that tried to kill him. Joe Colombo was a big wheel in the organization in New York City in the early 60s. Some other big wheel or wheels decided to take over Joe's part of the business. He or they hired a contract killer, some black guy, to shoot Joe in the middle of a New York City parade. I don't know what they paid the guy, promised him, or threatened him with, but he did it. Shot Joe Colombo in the middle of the parade, just like he was supposed to do. Didn't kill him, but left him paralyzed and confined to a wheelchair. A few thousand witnesses were there to see it, and a couple or three television cameras filmed it as well. Henry took another sip of his malt and smiled. What happened next is the interesting part. As soon as the black guy shoots and paralyzes Colombo, 5 big Sicilian gentlemen jump on top of him. The black guy is buried underneath of them. Don't forget, cameras are filming all of this. Okay, so there's this big dog pile of 6 people, and all of a sudden, whoomp, whoomp, 2 muffled shots. The 5 guys stand up, and there's 1 dead black guy lying on the ground with 2 .38 slugs in him, and a .38 revolver lying on the ground next to him. Smith & Wesson, I think it was. Anyway, the serial numbers on the gun have been destroyed with a punch, and every place on the gun that the shooter would have touched is wrapped with friction tape, including the trigger. Cops haul in the 5 big Sicilians, find out all of them test positive on the nitrate test, also find out none of them have social security numbers. Guess which one they decided to charge with the murder of the black guy? I have no idea, Cindy said. Neither did the cops, so they let them all go. What? They let them all go. Had to. Not one of the Sicilians had anything. Not one single word. Soon as one of them claimed something, anything, the cops could go to work on that one thing, find out if it was true or not, get the guy on the stand, nail him for perjury, if nothing else, whatever. Take hold of one loose thread and unravel the whole cloth. But there was no loose thread. What about the test? If tests for nitrates, which are found in both gunpowder and fertilizer, cops knew if they looked hard enough, they'd find someone who'd seen all 5 of the men carrying bags of fertilizer that day. Even without the fertilizer, proving all 5 of them shot a gun since their last bath doesn't make them guilty of murder. State had no case. They had to let all 5 of them go. Henry stared at Cindy Caswell. You understand the significance of this event, he asked pointedly. I think so. How did Fat Tony Ferrato die? Henry demanded. He had a heart. Wrong, Henry cut in. How did Fat Tony Ferrato die? I don't know Wrong, Henry said again. How did Fat Tony Ferrato die? There was utter silence. How did Fat Tony Ferrato die? He repeated. Still silence. Were you forced to have sex with Fat Tony Ferrato? I hear the meatloaf here is good also, Cindy said pleasantly. Was Fat Tony Ferrato a sick bastard who liked to maim and torture the women he had sex with? I can't decide if I should have dessert or not tonight. Were you relieved when he had his heart attack? Were you glad he was no longer able to bother you? I was. She started to say something, then changed her mind. Going to have dessert, but I think I'll pass tonight. Henry smiled. Good idea. I think I'll order something else, though. He opened the menu. Oh, and one more thing. The medical examiner said that one of the reasons Ferrato's heart may have stopped beating was that after he had sex, but before he had a climax, someone shoved a piece of wood, maple to be exact, into his left eye and scrambled his brains. Henry watched as Cindy Caswell's eyes widened and her skin went slightly pale. You know anything about that? She started to speak once again, then caught herself. Think you should try the French fries. They're really good here. French fries it is, Henry said, and signaled for the waitress. October 10th, 1992. As his GMC Sport utility silently rocketed up the interstate's entrance ramp, Henry Bowman thought once again about how his old friend David Webb would have loved the boxy hot rod. It was exactly the kind of vehicle Henry had always felt the auto manufacturers should make for the kind of wealthy people who lived in St. Louis County. Stroker would be out racing people for money every time it rained, he thought with a smile. Henry pulled onto Interstate 64 east and kept his speed at 65 or a hair over. The back of Henry Bowman's GMC Typhoon was riding only slightly lower than usual under the load Henry had placed in the back. He had only 4,000 rounds of ammunition in the vehicle, along with all 5 of the machine guns he was taking. The other 12,000 rounds, all in belts, was being hauled by Steve Brush, another St. Louis shooting enthusiast. Steve had never fired a full automatic, and he had jumped on the chance when Henry had suggested he go to the big Kentucky machine gun shoot. Steve had left the St. Louis in his 1-ton pickup, a half an hour before Henry. Steve had detailed directions to the range, but Henry expected to catch him on the highway before he hit Kentucky border. With a full tank and an empty bladder, Henry thought, I ought to be there in 3 hours. Henry glanced in his rearview mirror and saw a bright yellow car approaching at about 30 mph speed advantage. Looks like a slope-nosed Porsche, Henry thought, as he watched the car move over into the left lane in anticipation of passing Henry's slower vehicle. Under normal circumstances, Henry Bowman would have ignored the other car. At the moment, though, Henry was heading for a big national shoot where he would get to see a lot of friends from around the country, and he had been thinking about David Webb only a few moments before. Henry Bowman was in the exceptionally good mood. If Stroker were here, he'd insist on making that guy hate life, Henry thought with a smile as he reached down under the driver's seat and turned a lever-operated valve on the floor. As the yellow sports car swept past him, Henry pushed the GMC's throttle to the floor. The 4-speed automatic dropped down 2 gears as the turbo rapidly spooled up. The tach jumped to a bit over 5,000 RPM, and the needle on the boost gauge moved into the positive territory as Henry felt himself pressed back in the leather seat. At 63 RPM, the transmission shifted into third, and the boost needle blipped up another 3 psi as the turbine wheel suddenly found itself pressurizing a slow-turning engine. At 115 miles per hour, the Typhoon shifted into high gear, and the boost needle held steady at an 8 psi. Henry saw that he was steadily gaining on the yellow German car. The cheap stuff ought to burn out of the lines by now, Henry thought, as he reached down to turn a knob, unobtrusively located at the bottom of the dashboard. When Henry had flipped the lever on the floor, he had switched to his auxiliary fuel tank. Aftermarket tanks were designed for people who wanted to extend their range of their trucks or sport utility vehicles, but Henry had installed his for a different purpose. The 12-gallon bladder was always kept topped off with 108-octane race gas that Henry bought in 55-gallon drums from a local Unocal distributor. The knob on the dash controlled an adjustment wastegate. It was part of the GMC's new, larger exhaust system that had been installed at the same time that Henry had the Typhoon's heads ported. The block decked and O-ringed, the crank balanced, the turbo scroll housing reworked, the pistons and rods replaced, a bigger intercooler and radiator installed, and the electronics reprogrammed from a different fuel curve. As Henry twisted the knob clockwise, the boost needle started climbing and the GMC reacted as if a giant had poked the rear bumper with his finger. When Henry saw 20 psi on the gauge, he let go of the knob and put his right hand back on the steering wheel. Mike Garland was listening to the Porsche's compact disc player, and like all people who are exempt from speed limits, he almost never used his rearview mirror. 100 was a comfortable speed for long-distance cruising, and his only thought about driving concerned the spare traffic that lay ahead of him. Out of long habit, he stayed in the right lane when possible and only switched to the left lane when overtaking a slower vehicle. Like fast drivers everywhere, he hated left lane bandits that clogged the interstates, but the fact was that Mike Garland had never been passed when traveling in the 90-plus range, where the Porsche seemed happiest. He was totally unprepared for the black GMC wearing truck plates that blew by him with a solid 40-mile-per-hour edge. He stared at his own speedometer, then watched in amazement as the rapidly disappearing truck signaled with its right blinker and returned to the right lane. Henry Bowman focused his eyes far ahead of him on the highway and was relieved to see that the nearest vehicle was well over a mile away. He did not like to pass people at wildly extra-legal speeds unless those people were also flagrantly disregarding the posted limit. A lot of people on the roads were fundamentally envious and resentful of high-speed travelers. And the proliferation of cellular phones had given these drivers the ability to act on their frustrations. Got at least another minute, Henry decided. More than enough time. Mike Garland downshifted and gave the German sports car full throttle as the GMC became a shrinking spot in the distance. The European spec 3.3-liter engine was capable of pushing the sleek vehicle to a top speed 20 miles per hour higher than that of the hot-rodded GMC. But Garland faced 3 huge obstacles to catching up with the vanishing truck. First, it would take time to accelerate it up to a speed greater than the truck's. And until the Porsche got there, the GMC would relentlessly increase the already substantial gap. Second, the Porsche had not had a good front end alignment since it left Germany, and although the toe end was not off enough to notice at normal highway speeds, by 130 the car became disturbingly twitchy. Last of all, although Mike Garland had spent a lot of time driving at speeds of over 100 miles per hour, he had virtually no experience in the 140 and up range. At about 145, discretion became the better part of valor, and he backed off. Mike Garland held the yellow car at the indicated 110 and watched in amazement as the distant GMC continued to grow smaller and then vanish from his sight entirely. He reached out and tapped the speedometer, then immediately felt foolish for doing so. Henry Bowman kept an eye on the water temperature gauge and noted with satisfaction that it did not rise above 180 degrees, despite the lengthy full throttle blast. The GMC was reassuringly stable and 2.5 times the speed limit, and the exhaust note was not excessive, but the wind noise was something else. Back to the real world, Henry thought, as a clump of cars came into view and rapidly grew larger as he closed in on them at 80 miles per hour speed differential. Henry Bowman slowly eased off the throttle, and the boxy vehicle slowed down instantly under the tremendous aerodynamic drag. Would have helped if the guys in styling had rounded the corners a little on the S10 before the GM skunkworks streamed this thing up, Henry thought. Then he reminded himself that the GM's project planners' hair would have stood on end if they had been told what the boys at Ken Bell were going to do with their creation. Henry slid in behind a flatbed truck traveling about 60 miles per hour in the right lane. The left lane was filled with 4 cars traveling the same speed. They were closely trailing a brown Lincoln whose driver was oblivious to the line of cars behind him. Henry was looking for a decent station at the GMC's radio when he heard a horn sound and looked to his left. It was the man in the yellow slope-nosed 911. He was waving and motioning to Harry with eating and drinking gestures. It appeared that the man wanted to pull off at the next exit where they could grab some hamburgers and talk about cars. Henry nodded agreement and held up 2 fingers to indicate the second exit coming up. He had never seen a slope-nosed 911 up close. "What on earth is that thing?" Mike Garland asked as he climbed out of his car. The 2 men were in the parking lot of a Hardee's restaurant just off the interstate. "This is the Typhoon," Henry explained. "Engine and trans out of a Grand National, hooked up to full-time 4-wheel drive." Garland stared at the vehicle, and Henry went on, speaking with the courtesy that comes naturally to a victor. "It's the most sensible car I've ever seen. A lot of guys I know with cars like yours have rural property, with a half-mile of rutted, rocky dirt road leading from the state-maintained pavement. So they buy a Wagoneer, a Blazer, a Bronco, and they end up driving the beater on 2-hour interstate trips because the last half-mile would rip the undercarriage out of their good car. I always thought the solution would be if BMW would put an onboard air compressor and air shocks on their high-speed sedans. Let the drivers raise the ride height 4 or 5 inches for negotiating farm roads. Might cost $300, and it would be easy to incorporate an electronic governor so that the car couldn't be driven over 35 miles an hour when it was jacked up," Henry laughed. No one in marketing at any of the car companies ever approved the idea, but GM came up with an even better solution. Took their S10 and put in full-time 4-wheel drive, independent front suspension, lowered ride height, wide wheels with Z-rated tires, and the intercooled turbo V6 out of the Grand National. Hit 113 seconds in the rain by my watch with no wheel spin. Henry grinned and laughed when he saw the man shaking his head. "I surprised you," he assured him. "You'd have caught me easily with a little more room. This thing's a barn door compared to your 911. Like any good street racer, Henry wasn't about to let on about what he had done to his engine. "Henry Bowman," he said as he stuck out his hand. "Mike Garland." Henry eyed the license plate affixed to the rear of the German car. "You work for the government?" "Yeah, U.S. Customs. Confiscated vehicle. Guy was trying to smuggle drugs in it." Henry nodded. This would be a good guy to know for ironing out problems with ammo import deals, he thought. A recent import shipment of Yugoslavian surplus ammo had been held up for 3 months because the declaration form had not listed the importation of Yugoslavian straw in addition to the ammunition. The shippers had used the straw as packaging between a few of the crates, and the storage fees had tripled the amount the ammunition had ultimately cost Henry. "Can I see the engine compartment?" Not that I know anything about one of these, Henry added. Sure, Garland replied, and lifted the rear deck lid. Guy would have to be brain damaged to use a car like this as a smuggling vehicle, Henry thought to himself when he saw the mechanicals. Customs would be all over it in any way. It's not even federalized. How much dope did he have in it, and how much time did he get? Henry asked. There was a lot less coke than we expected, but he had a sharp lawyer, and we couldn't prove he had put the stuff in there himself. Henry nodded. So what really happened is some schlep tried to bring in a Porsche that didn't pass your rules about air pumps and crash standards, and you snowflaked him so you could steal his car and keep it for yourself without actually bringing charges. You ready to go eat? Garland asked. Yeah, just let me get my road atlas. Henry opened the back of the GMC and then swore. Damn, it's buried under these crates. Hang on just a second. Mike Garland looked on in astonishment as Henry hoisted 3 obviously heavy wooden crates out of the back and poked around in the vehicle before emerging with a battered atlas. Then Henry lifted the crates back into his truck and locked the back. How much weight you got in there? The custom agents demanded. Oh, hell, not all that much, Henry said with a shake of his head. Maybe 1,300 pounds. Going to a big military weapons shoot and demonstration in Kentucky. And I got to have plenty of ammo for all the demos they got me signed up for. He turned towards the restaurant. Let's make sure we sit somewhere with a view of the cars, Henry added over his shoulder. He knew Mike Garland was still slack-jawed over the GMC's weight penalty that he had just discovered. The pair had a pleasant lunch together and ended up exchanging business cards. Garland had promised that if he was given advance warning, Henry would not have any more problems like he'd had with the Yugoslavian shipment. Henry told him to give him a call when Customs wanted a live fire demonstration of the latest full auto weaponry. Henry Bowman pulled off Route 31 and passed a liquor store painted bright pink. Steve Brush was parked in the store's lot and started his engine when he saw his friend. In about a half mile, they came to a big familiar sign at the entrance of the range that the range crew always erected for the shoot. Henry took the turnoff and was dutifully followed by his friend in the pickup truck. The Knob Creek Range was about 40 miles south of Louisville, on property which adjoined Fort Knox. Decades earlier, it had been an artillery testing range before it had outlived its usefulness to the military and the government had sold the property. The old steel tracks leading up to the firing line offered mute reminder that railway cars had been required to bring in the big guns and pallets of ammunition for testing. The hillside 400 yards away had an awful lot of metal buried in its face. Twice a year, in April and October, the owners of Knob Creek put on a machine gun shoot. Spectator admission was a few dollars, and spots on the firing line were $80 for the entire weekend. There was a 10-year waiting list for the latter, and most shooters ended up paying a reduced fee to get on the line as a helper. What the annual EAA fly-in at Oshkosh, Wisconsin was to people who loved to fly, or the Cologne show in Germany was to people who liked exotic cars, the Knob Creek event was to people who loved to shoot. 2 million rounds went downrange in a 3-day period. The organizers put out stacks of old tires, stripped cars, and junk appliances to shoot at. What made it more interesting was the bundles of ditching dynamite the explosives crew thoughtfully taped to the front of many of the targets. It was like a giant fireworks display, but with active involvement. Soon the two Missourians passed some big open fields filled with parked cars, and a man in the orange hunting vest and orange cap stopped them. Henry already had his window down. Got a bunch of guns and over 15,000 rounds of ammo to unload up at that firing line, he said, jerking his thumb towards Steve to show the man that the two vehicles were together. We know the drill. The range worker smiled and waved them through. He liked people who brought large quantities of ammunition to send down range. They were what made the shoot so successful. Henry and Steve slowly threaded their vehicles through the maze of cars, vans, pickups, motorhomes, deuce-and-a-halfs, half-tracks, armored cars, and tanks. Thousands of people were milling around, many with small children on their shoulders. It reminded Steve Brush of the big riverfront fair in St. Louis on the 4th of July weekend, except that he had never in his life seen such an array of ordnance as was packed together along the 350-foot firing line. Henry stopped a short distance down the line and got out of his vehicle. We'll just be a minute unloading, then we'll be out of here, he said to a range officer who looked like he was about to tell Henry he couldn't park there. Unload the buckets right here, Steve. This is where we're going to shoot. The belted ammunition Henry had loaded for his water-cooled Browning was stored in 5-gallon plastic buckets. Each bucket held 4 coiled 250-round belts. It had taken Henry 15 hours to belt up 12,000 rounds of 30-06 and 8mm ammunition that Steve Brush was now unloading from the back of his truck. Henry had filled the 48 cloth belts using John Browning's designed hand-cranked belt filling machine that had been made in 1918. Some people brought their ammo loose to the chute and loaded it into magazines and belts during the many ceasefires during the day. Henry preferred to load everything in advance and have free time to talk with friends and see who had what for sale. "Is this your spot?" Steve Brush asked, still a bit overwhelmed by the entire spectacle. "No, I'm still on the waiting list after 6 years. This spot belongs to John Parker, but we're going to shoot on it. He's from St. Louis, so you may have seen him around, although he dresses like a bum when he's here." "What's he do?" "Senior partner in a brokerage firm, Parker Gates and Company. He's pretty well connected, knows all the big shots in St. Louis, particularly the ones in finance and investments. I've sold him a bunch of machine guns, like that water-cooled Browning there." Sitting to the left of the chalk line that designated the right boundary of Parker's 6-foot spot was a 1917 A1 Browning on an A1 tripod with custom double-length legs. There was a pile of fired brass under it that Henry estimated numbered about 6,000. "Looks like he's shooting mid-50s Egyptian 8mm Mauser ammo," Henry thought, as he looked at the shape and color of the fired cases under the gun. 8mm Egyptian was corrosive and could be had for about 10 cents a round. If you bought in 500,000 round lots, this was less than half the cost of surplus 30-06 ammo. Henry looked at the feed tray of Parker's gun. The homemade spacer there confirmed his suspicion. "Hey, Henry," a voice called in greeting. "You bring your Colt monitor to this trip? Shoot Landy's parachute flares out of the sky and piss him off again?" "Of course. What would Knob Creek be if we couldn't irritate Bob?" "How about your mini-me?" "Yep, got one of Reed's fancy suppressors on it. Supposed to outlast an M16. I'm going to see how it holds up on a real gun." The man grinned at his reply and moved on. "Who is that?" Steve Brush asked. "Some guy that's here every time. Half the people that say hi to me, they've never told me their names." He looked at the crowd. "We better get the rest of the stuff unloaded and get the vehicles moved. The parking Gestapo here have no sense of humor." Henry opened the back of his vehicle and started unloading the 5 guns he had brought with him. "Follow me," Henry said when he was done. "I'll show you where we can park that's not to hell and gone from here." "Is it okay to leave your guns right there on the ground?" Steve Brush asked with a worried look. "Do you think anyone's going to steal guns in the middle of this bunch?" Henry asked, waving his hand at the hundreds of people milling around the firing lane, over half of whom were carrying loaded handguns on their persons. "You got a point. Okay, lead on." "Hey, Henry Bowman," another voice called. "You going to turn your F&D red tonight, like you did last year?" "Probably," Henry said with a smile as he looked up at the man. The man turned to his companion. "This guy Bowman here, he likes BARs. Shoots shit out of the air with them. Put his Belgium one on a tripod last fall and ran, 20 magazines? Through the damn thing as fast as he could, turned as red as your electric stove and never missed a beat. BARs are like that," Henry said cheerfully as he got back into his vehicle. "Can you believe they're not going to even charge the FBI, asshole?" one of the men said in disgust. A lengthy ceasefire was in effect while targets were set up, and the men and women at the range were, as always, talking about what guns people had brought to shoot, who had the best bargains in ammo, and which statist politicians needed to be thrown out of office in the upcoming congressional elections. In addition to these standard topics, talk that day at Knob Creek Range often turned to the disastrous FBI raid in Idaho that had ended 7 weeks earlier. Randy Weaver, his friend Kevin Harris, and Weaver's 3 daughters, aged 10 months to 16 years, had remained in his cabin for 9 days after the FBI sniper had killed Vicky. During the standoff, and at the urging of the neighbors, thousands of citizens had converged on the area to keep an eye on what the feds did and to implore Weaver and Harris to surrender so that they and the girls could not also be killed by the federal agents. Messages to Weaver had been smuggled into the cabin by friends and sympathizers, and after considering that his friend Kevin Harris was seriously wounded, Weaver had come out peacefully on August 31st. The entire Weaver incident, starting with the wood buttstock that was 3/8 of an inch too short, had disgusted everyone at the Kentucky shooting range. Ever since the Ken Ballou raid, however, serious shooters had come to expect disaster when the ATF claimed a paperwork or tax violation had been committed. Weaver and Lawmaster were only the most recent examples in a long list of this kind of stormtrooper behavior. Up until the Weaver incidents, however, citizens had always understood that even the tax agents destroyed a man's house or smashed his door in and shot him in the head without a proper warrant. The gun owner's family was off limits. Federal marshals killing 14-year-old Sammy Weaver by shooting him in the back and an FBI sniper blowing Vicki Weaver's brains out as she nursed her baby were a new development. The people at Knob Creek and at ranges, gun shops, and sporting goods stores across the nation found this escalation of federal force extraordinarily repellent. Ought to be at least slap that FBI bastard with a manslaughter rap, the man continued. Hell, in Time magazine, feds claimed their HRT guys could put a bullet within a quarter inch of where they wanted to at 200 yards. Maybe that was a misprint, one of the other men suggested derisively. Maybe what the feds said was 2 yards. He thought a moment, then added, or maybe that guy did pull his bullet exactly where he wanted. Yeah, killing a man's wife while she's nursing their baby daughter is a damned effective negotiating tactic. I can't believe that Yamaguchi fucker, or whatever his name is, gets to just walk away without so much as a $10 fine. Joe, you're not thinking straight, Henry Bowman said to the man. The FBI has huge public support. Hoover started a massive PR campaign 60 years ago, and it's continued ever since. Jimmy Stewart movies, Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. in his TV show, the public and the press love the feds. I don't. Maybe not, but everyone else does. Most of the adults in this country can tell you exactly where the FBI shot John Dillinger. In front of the Biograph Theater? Right. But how many people know the FBI also managed to shoot 2 bystanders in the process? Go to your library and see how much ink that got in 34. Henry shook his head and continued. 6 years ago, there was one word of official criticism or apology for the way they handled the Miami shootout. FBI's official conclusion was that their guns weren't powerful enough. Did you see one newspaper article about how 2 of their stakeout agents were too busy banging some waitress to help their buddies who were getting blasted? Did you see the Time magazine saying something like this? Henry lowered his voice in a parody of a news anchorman. The FBI has a thorough training program for handling vehicles they suspect contain heavily armed known killers. Their state-of-the-art tactics include sex breaks to relieve tension, leaving their body armor and shotguns on the floor of their back seats, taking their pistols out of their holsters and putting them on the front seats so they can fly off and get lost, tailgating the suspects to let them know they have been spotted, and ramming the suspect's vehicle off the road in densely populated residential areas to precipitate a gunfight. Humorless laughter followed Henry Bowman's mock news segment. Though none of the facts he had mentioned had been highly publicized, they were common knowledge among people seriously involved in the shooting sports. Serious shooters invariably had a number of contacts inside law enforcement agencies. Way I see it, one of the other men in the group said, "It's a goddamn miracle Weaver and his daughters are still alive. I'd have expected them all to come off that mountain in body bags instead of just the mother and the boy." Feds must be getting slow, another man in the group offered. In 6 months, the FBI would be back up to speed. I see your water cooled's working okay, Henry said to John Parker as he sipped from a paper cup full of soda. Parker was sitting on the seat he had made, which fit on the extended rear leg of a 1917 A1's tripod. Parker's girlfriend, Karen Hill, a paralegal who was with him for the weekend, sat on one of Henry's ammo buckets. Henry and Steve were leaning against one of the concrete benches. They were waiting while the dynamite crew went downrange to make sure there was no unexploded charges left from the 3 o'clock shoot. Yeah, I'm glad you talked to me about buying a 17 instead of an A4. You were right, with the muzzle supported in the front bearing of the water jacket. It's a lot more accurate at long range than the air-cooled guns. As I think I demonstrated, Parker said with a grin. Using the click adjustments of the 1917 A1 tripod, John Parker had managed to hit 2 of the 15 dynamite charges the crew had set out downrange. That was exceptional, considering that there were over 50 belt-fed machine guns on the line, and they had all begun firing continuously as soon as the range officer had given the command. Haven't seen a single bush bumper sticker, Henry Bowman said calmly as he took another drink of the soda. John Parker nodded. No shit, I think he's going to lose. Lose? Hell, Henry said. He's already thrown the election. Parker raised an eyebrow in questioning gesture. Henry continued, We'd been much better off with Michael Dukakis from a civil rights standpoint, at least. What do you mean? This came from a slender man in a khaki shirt who had overheard the conversation. Bush banned semi-auto imports by executive order in '89. Got his drug czar buddy to say it was a wonderful idea. Could Dukakis have gotten away with that? Hell no. He wouldn't have dared try it because the Republicans in the House and Senate wouldn't have played ball. They'd have screamed bloody murder. Bush got away with it, though, because he's a Republican and now it's going to cost him his election. Come on, Henry, Parker said, forcefully but without rancor. Bush has all kinds of problems. The economy is lousy, and people haven't forgiven him for breaking his no new taxes promise. And let's face it, Karen Hill added, a lot of voters, particularly women, don't like his anti-abortion stance. Those are things that are going to end up costing him the presidency. Henry Bowman was shaking his head. A crowd was starting to gather, but no one interrupted. I'll give you the taxes thing, but that's still only a small factor, and I'll prove it to you in a second. Your other issues are curtain dressing. Economy? The economy was terrible in 1982, and the public didn't turn against Ronald Reagan. Reagan was also at least as much against abortion as Bush, and more women voted for him than Carter in '80 and Mondale in '84. The reason George Bush will lose in 3 weeks is because he sold us out on gun rights. Henry Bowman and John Parker both saw a number of people around them nodding in agreement. John Parker began to protest. That may be part of it, but no buts, John. I'll prove it to you. Look around. How many guys do you see here right now who you know saw active duty and are proud of it? I don't mean everybody wearing camo. Anyone can buy that at Kmart. I mean guys wearing boonie hats and dog tags with their division numbers on them, or guys in Gulf War uniforms, or old guys with tattoos and shrapnel wounds and missing arms. How many do you see around here right now? A lot, right? George Bush is a genuine war hero from the Second World War, right? And last year, he got 500,000 men over to Iraq, ran Hussein out of Kuwait, and only lost, 80 soldiers? That's less than I would expect would get killed in 500,000 man training exercise with no enemy. The men gathered around were nodding in agreement. So, John Parker said, so Bush is a war hero. I really mean that. And look who he's running against. Should be no contest among vets proud of their military service, right? Henry grinned wickedly at John Parker. Just go around and ask some of these vets here if they're going to vote for the president in 3 weeks. Take your own poll. I'm not, shouted a veteran of Korea who had been listening to Henry's argument. Your friend's dead right. Me neither, spat another. He sold us out. 6 other veterans grunted in agreement. No one contradicted what Henry Bowman had said. Is anyone here, not just veterans, but anyone planning to vote for Bush? Henry asked in a loud voice. No one volunteered with an affirmative answer. John Parker's mouth opened in amazement. Too many Republicans have this crazy idea that since their party usually isn't quite as much in favor of throwing away the linchpin of the Bill of Rights, they can take our votes for granted. Henry said to what now a crowd of 40 or 50 people, in a few weeks, they're going to find out that taking us for granted was the biggest mistake they ever made in their lives, except when the news will undoubtedly focus on the abortion issue, or the bad economy, or how Bush didn't seem compassionate, or some other horse shit and miss the real story. You really think we're the ones going to cost him the election? A man in his 50s asked. Not saying I disagree with you, but everyone always acts like all the other issues are the real important ones. You know, the ones that get elections won or lost. Let me ask everyone here a question, then Henry said. It was obvious he believed in what he was about to say. Pretend I'm George Bush, and it's Monday, the day after tomorrow. The first debate, which is tomorrow night, is over. I didn't say anything at all about the gun issue in the debate. It's now Monday, okay? Since I'm still the president, I tell the networks I'm going to give a State of the Union address or a press conference or whatever you call it on short notice. I'm going to give it that night since the second debate isn't for a couple of days. I get up in front of the camera and here's the speech that goes out over every network Monday night. Henry looked over at John Parker. Cut me some slack if I get some of the details wrong. I'm winging it here, okay? He cleared his throat. My fellow Americans, I would like to address a serious issue which faces our country today. The gradual erosion of the individual rights of our honest citizens. Our government, including my administration, must shoulder much of the blame for this problem. It is time for me to acknowledge and repair the damage that's been done. Henry paused for a moment to collect his thoughts before continuing. The Soviet Union has collapsed. People around the world are throwing off their yokes of oppression and tasting freedom for the first time. It is an embarrassing fact, however, that our government has forgotten about individual rights here at home. It is time to acknowledge and correct the infringements we have inflicted upon our citizens in the name of crime control. Decent, honest Americans are being victimized by a tiny fraction of the population, and it is our government's fault. It is our fault because we politicians have continually passed laws that strip the law-abiding of their rights. As a result, we have made the crime problem much worse. Our great economic power comes from the fact that Americans determine their own economic destiny. It is time we let Americans once again determine their own physical destiny. Henry Bowman saw the audience hanging on his words. He took a breath and went on. In 1989, I prohibited importation of firearms mechanically and functionally identical to weapons made before the Wright brothers' invention of the airplane in 1903. I hoped that banning these guns would reduce crime. It hasn't. The only people denied the weapons that I banned are those citizens in our country who obey our laws. These are not the people our government should punish, and now I see what a terrible decision that was. Some politicians are now calling for a national 5-day waiting period to purchase a handgun. The riots last spring showed us the tragedy of that kind of policy. One congressman has even introduced a bill to repeal the Second Amendment to our Constitution. The Bill of Rights enumerates human rights. It does not grant them. That is something that we in government have forgotten. Repealing the Second Amendment would not legitimize our actions any more than repealing the Fifth Amendment would authorize us to kill whoever we wanted. Henry noticed several people smile at the notion of George Bush acknowledging his responsibility for government intrusions in a State of the Union address. All dictatorships restrict or prohibit the honest citizen's access to modern small arms. Anywhere this right is not restricted, you will find a free country. There is a name for a society where only the police have guns. It is called a police state. The Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights is not about duck hunting any more than the First Amendment is about playing Scrabble. The entire Bill of Rights is about individual freedom. In my recent trip to St. Louis, Missouri, I found that violent criminals have a government guarantee that honest people are unarmed if they're away from their homes or businesses. It's a felony for a citizen to carry a gun for protection. Giving evil, violent people who ignore our laws a government guarantee that decent people are completely helpless is terrible public policy. It is dangerous public policy. Our federal and state governments have betrayed the honest citizens of this country by focusing on inanimate objects instead of violent criminal behavior. And I'm ashamed to have been a party to it. It is time to correct that betrayal. Accordingly, I am lifting the import ban on weapons with a military appearance, effective immediately. I am abandoning any and all proposals to ban honest citizens from owning guns or magazines that hold more than a certain number of cartridges. I will veto any bill that contains any provision which will make it illegal, more difficult, or more expensive for any honest citizen to obtain any firearm or firearm accessory that is now lawful for him to own. I will also encourage the removal of laws currently in effect which punish honest adults for mere ownership or possession of weapons or for paperwork errors involving weapons. I will work to effect repeal of the Gun Control Act of 1968 and National Firearms Act of 1934 in their entirety. Tomorrow, I will appoint a task force to investigate abusive practices of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. I will ask for recommendation as to how that department can be made to shift its focus from technical and paperwork errors to violent criminal activity. I will demand the resignations of all agents and supervisors who have participated in any entrapment schemes or planting of evidence. Our government has betrayed its citizens, and tomorrow morning I intend to start correcting that. Good night. Screams of, "Yeah, damn right, and that's it," came amidst tremendous applause from the several dozen people who had been standing around listening. "Okay, that's the speech," Henry said in his normal voice after the applause had died down. He did not notice the look on John Parker's face. Then, the next morning on the news, you see that Bush has indeed rescinded the import ban. He's named the people on the task force, and he's fired Bill Bennett. A couple of senators have offered to draft legislation repealing the National Firearms Act and GCA 68, and you hear Bush say on camera that he's all for it, and you hear him encourage other legislators to support this much-needed reform. Question number 1, what are all of you going to do now? Do everything we can to get George Bush reelected, one man yelled immediately. He was joined by a dozen similar responses. Henry Bowman laughed. Not bad, and we haven't even asked question number 2, and it's the real clincher. If George Bush gave the speech I just gave and did the things I just described, how many people who were already going to vote for him do you think would change their minds? How many people do you think would say, boy, I was going to vote for Bush, but now I'm not going to? Nobody, John Parker said under his breath. Anyone who didn't like your speech would already be against the president. John Parker was thinking frantically. Exactly. So he picks up 4 or 5 million votes and loses none. A damn geologist who likes to shoot has just laid out how Bush can pull it off, John Parker said. I wonder if it's too late. He looked over at Karen Hill. You bring your laptop? Parker asked his companion. Is it in the car? She nodded, and a smile came over her face. John Parker, are you thinking what I think you're thinking? The young woman asked her friend. Bucky, you got it. Any objections to taking dictation? Hell, I'll sit on Henry's lap and undo a couple buttons on my blouse if that's what it takes. Parker laughed and then explained what he planned to do. Worth a try, Henry answered. Others in the group readily agreed. In the midst of the large crowd of shooters, all of whom had been listening intently, no one paid any attention to the man who left the group abruptly and began walking towards the parking area. Hello? The deputy director of the ATF answered as he picked up the private line in his office in Washington. Working on Saturdays unheard of in this building, Dwight Greenwell thought, but I like having the entire place to myself. It's Rivera, sir, in Kentucky. Something's come up here I think you should know about. What is it? Man from St. Louis at the shoot here knows the president's brother. Guy's name is John Parker. Some dealer. I don't know his name. But like all these guys here, he shoots machine guns. This dealer was shooting his mouth off like they always do. He was going on in front of a big group about how he wished the president would change his mind on the gun thing. John Parker was listening, and he gets the idea to get a hold of his brother. The agent explained about the rough content of the speech Henry had made and John Parker's plan to contact the president's brother in time to save the election. Shit, that'd be just what we need, Greenwell said after he listened to his undercover agent describe what the two men had in mind. George Bush had given ATF a huge boost with his executive order banning imports of military lookalikes. His expected successor promised to be even more receptive to expand ATF power. The president do an about-face and urge repeal of not only the import ban, but all the other laws enforced, then win re-election? Greenwell thought. The prospect was not a pleasant one, especially in view of the current internal problems that plagued the agency and the imminent threat of budget cuts. He sat contemplating all this when his thoughts were interrupted. Do we have anyone that could intercept the facts? The agent in Kentucky asked after the silence became too much for him. Goddamn fool, Greenwell thought immediately. Breaking into the office of the brother of the president struck the deputy director as a good way to get his agency disbanded and himself a visit to federal prison. Talking about it on the telephone was equally stupid. Everyone said you had a good sense of humor, the Fed assured his undercover man, for the benefit of anyone who might be recording the call. I doubt the president is going to reverse his position on the strength of some stranger's advice, particularly a gun nut, even if he does get brought to him by his brother. At least, I hope he won't, he added mentally. If he is, there's nothing we can do about it anyway. Get back there and keep your ears open, though. This is exactly the kind of intelligence we need, to know what we're up against. Yes, sir, the man said, and folded up his cellular phone. Dwight Greenwell sat back in his chair thinking, wiretapping and electronic eavesdropping, when it involved high-up politicos, was a very risky proposition. The hoped-for benefits almost never outweighed the potential for disaster. John Parker, he thought, as he called up a screen on his computer. Haven't heard that name before. He tapped the name in on the keyboard and waited for his computer to find the file. No wonder. He's not a dealer. John Parker had a number of machine guns, but he had bought them all as a private individual with a $200 tax stamp on each transfer. What is it about these damn gun nuts? He asked himself. It was a question he contemplated daily, and it baffled him no less now than it had when he had first taken the job. He sat in his chair thinking about what the undercover agent in Kentucky had told him and decided to do nothing. A sitting president's businessman brother is one sleeping dog I'm going to let lie. His mind returned to the specter of budget cuts, and Greenwell smiled. A plan was well underway at ATF to solve that little problem. 6 months from now, he thought happily, we'll get anything we ask for. The night shoot was as spectacular as usual. The crew set out drums full of used printer solvent with explosive charges in front. Railroad flares burned nearby. At the commence firing command, thousands of tracers laced out into the night. Dynamite charges exploded and vaporized the liquid in the drums. The flares ignited it, and huge fireballs erupted one after another. The heat from the fiery explosions warmed the faces of the spectators 200 yards away. The fires died out as the solvent was consumed, only to be followed by more explosions as other shots found their marks at the bases of the remaining drums. Just like a James Bond movie, huh? Henry yelled happily. He was shooting belts of straight tracer in his 1917 A1. The precise support of the muzzle end of the barrel and the constant stream of tracers made the water-cooled Browning shoot like a laser. Henry hit 4 charges, causing an equal number of explosions. Despite the magnificent display, John Parker was only half paying attention. He was thinking about the facts he was going to send as soon as he got to his motel room. All right, we're going to go ahead and stop this section here. So we just finished on page 493 of the hardback edition, and that was section 2P. We will continue with 2Q on page 494 in the next episode. Until then, take care, everyone.